Today we're starting Chapter 1, The Science of Biology. In this chapter, we'll build a clear foundation for understanding what biology actually is, why it matters, and how scientists investigate the living world. As we go, you'll see that biology is much more than memorizing facts about plants, animals, or cells. It's the study of life in all its forms and the processes that connect living things to each other and to their environment. We'll also look at how biologists ask questions, gather evidence, and use scientific thinking to explain the world around us. By the end of this chapter, you should have a stronger sense of how biology works as both a subject and a scientific discipline. Biology is the study of life, but that simple definition covers an enormous range of ideas. Biology helps us understand how living things are built, how they function, how they grow, and how they interact with the world around them. One of the most important concepts in biology is that the cell is the most basic unit of life. Every living organism is made of one or more cells, and those cells carry out the activities needed to keep the organism alive. So when we study biology, we're really studying life from its smallest living unit all the way up to entire organisms and ecosystems. Biological organization helps us see that life is arranged in levels, moving from simpler structures to more complex systems. For example, molecules combine to form cells, cells form tissues, tissues build organs, and organs work together in organ systems. Those systems make up an organism, and organisms interact within populations, communities, and ecosystems. As you move through these levels, new properties appear that you wouldn't notice by looking at just one smaller part alone. That increasing complexity is one of the key patterns biologists study because it helps explain how life is organized and how different parts work together. To understand biology, we also need to understand cells because every living thing is made of them. There are two main types of cells. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, which is a membrane-bound structure that contains the cell's genetic material. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, so their DNA is not enclosed in the same way. Even with these differences, all cells share some essential features. They are surrounded by a membrane that separates the inside of the cell from its environment, and they use DNA as their genetic information. These shared traits help explain why cells are considered the basic building blocks of life. Another important distinction in biology is the difference between unicellular and multicellular organisms. A unicellular organism is made of just one cell, and that single cell performs all the functions needed for life. In contrast, a multicellular organism is made of many cells that often specialize in different jobs. For example, some cells may help with movement, others with protection, and others with transporting materials. This difference matters because it shows how life can exist in both very simple and very complex forms. Whether an organism has one cell or many, the cell remains the basic unit that makes life possible. Biologists also classify life into three major domains, which are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria are prokaryotic organisms and include many of the common bacteria we hear about in everyday life. Archaea are also prokaryotic, but they are different from bacteria in important genetic and biochemical ways, and many of them live in extreme environments. The third domain, eukarya, includes all eukaryotic organisms, which means their cells have a nucleus. This domain contains kingdoms such as plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Learning these three domains gives us a broad framework for organizing the diversity of life on Earth. So, what makes something alive? Biologists often describe living things by a set of shared characteristics. Living organisms grow and develop over time, they respond to stimuli in their environment, and they reproduce to pass on life to the next generation. They also obtain and use energy to carry out life processes. In addition, all living things have a genetic code, usually in the form of DNA, and all are made of cells. These characteristics help scientists distinguish living organisms from non-living things and provide a basic checklist for defining life. One more key idea in biology is homeostasis, which is the ability of an organism to maintain a stable internal environment. Even when conditions outside the body change, living things work to keep internal conditions within a certain range so they can continue functioning properly. A simple example is body temperature. When you're too hot, your body produces sweat to help cool you down. When you're too cold, you shiver to generate heat. These responses may seem ordinary, but they show an important biological principle. Life depends on constant regulation and balance. Another central theme in biology is evolution, which simply means change over time in populations of organisms. Evolution helps explain both the diversity of life and the similarities we see among living things. It shows how species adapt, how traits are passed on, and how organisms are connected through shared ancestry. That's why evolution is often described as the unifying idea of biology. The biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky captured this by saying, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." In other words, many biological patterns become much clearer when we view them through the lens of change over time. Now, let's shift into the science process by looking at the idea of a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated, testable explanation or prediction based on what is already known. It isn't just a random guess, it should connect to prior observations or evidence, and it must be something that can actually be tested. Just as importantly, a hypothesis must be capable of being shown to be wrong if the evidence does not support it. For example, saying the bell will ring at the end of the period is a prediction that can be checked. In science, hypotheses guide investigation by giving us a clear idea to test against evidence. As scientists test ideas, they often work with a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis, sometimes called H0, states that there is no meaningful effect or no significant difference between what is expected and what is observed. The alternative hypothesis, or H1, is the idea the researcher actually wants to test and gather support for. Along with that, scientists often use controlled experiments, where one condition is kept unchanged as a baseline for comparison. This helps researchers determine whether a treatment or change actually caused the observed result. Together, these tools make scientific testing more organized, objective, and reliable. A fact is different from a hypothesis because a fact is an observation that can be repeatedly confirmed. In other words, it is something that has been directly observed and supported again and again. For example, if the bell rang last period, that is a fact because it actually happened and could be verified by observation. In science, facts are important because they provide the evidence scientists build on. Hypotheses, by contrast, are explanations or predictions that still need to be tested. Understanding the difference between facts and hypotheses helps us think more clearly about scientific reasoning. Scientists also use control groups to make sure an experiment is working the way it should. A positive control group is expected to produce a definite result, so it helps confirm that the experimental system is functioning correctly. If the positive control does not behave as expected, that can signal a problem with the setup. A negative control group, on the other hand, is not expected to respond to the variable being tested. This helps scientists check for false positives and see whether an effect might appear even when it shouldn't. Using both kinds of controls strengthens the reliability of an experiment and makes the results easier to trust. Let's look at a simple research question to see how scientific thinking works in practice. Suppose we ask, how does coffee affect blood pressure? That question is specific, measurable, and testable, which makes it a good scientific question. From there, a scientist could form a hypothesis, design an experiment, identify control groups, and collect data to see whether coffee causes a change. The key point is that science often begins with a focused question like this one. A strong question gives direction to the entire investigation and helps researchers decide what evidence they need to gather. To answer that coffee question scientifically, researchers would need a well-designed experiment. They might compare a group that drinks coffee with a group that does not, while keeping other factors as similar as possible. Then they could measure blood pressure and look for differences between the groups. This is where control groups become so important. They allow scientists to compare results fairly and reduce the chance that some other factor is causing the effect. A careful setup like this turns a simple question into a structured investigation that can produce useful evidence. When designing an experiment, scientists pay close attention to variables. The independent variable is the part of the experiment that the researcher deliberately changes. In a coffee experiment, that might be whether a person drinks coffee or how much coffee they drink. The dependent variable is what changes in response and what the scientist measures. In this case, blood pressure could be the dependent variable. Scientists collect data from the dependent variable so they can see whether changing the independent variable had an effect. Keeping these variables clear is essential for drawing meaningful conclusions from an experiment. Another important distinction in science is the difference between a theory and a law. A scientific theory explains how and why something happens. It is a well-supported model that helps scientists understand patterns and make predictions. A scientific law, on the other hand, describes what happens under certain conditions, but it does not explain the mechanism behind it. For example, the law of gravity describes the attraction between masses, while theories related to gravity work to explain how that attraction happens. A common misconception is that theories become laws when enough evidence builds up, but that is not true. Theories and laws serve different purposes in science. This distinction matters because science is not just a collection of facts. It is a way of organizing knowledge so we can both describe patterns and explain them. Laws help us summarize what consistently happens in nature, while theories help us understand the deeper reasons behind those patterns. When you hear the word theory in everyday conversation, it may sound uncertain, but in science, a theory is a powerful, evidence-based explanation. Keeping that meaning clear helps us better understand how scientific knowledge is built and communicated. Science also depends on standard measurement, which is why scientists use the metric system, also called the SI system. This system is based on powers of 10, which makes converting between units much simpler and more consistent. Instead of working with unrelated conversion numbers, scientists can move from one unit to another by shifting the decimal place. That consistency is especially useful when researchers compare results, repeat experiments, or share findings across countries and disciplines. Using a common measurement system helps make science more precise, efficient, and universal. Some of the most common SI units you'll see in science are the meter for length, the kilogram for mass, and the Kelvin for temperature. Length refers to the distance between 2 points, so meters are used to measure how far or how long something is. Mass refers to the amount of matter in an object, and that is measured in kilograms. Temperature in the SI system is measured in Kelvin, which is useful in many scientific calculations because it is based on an absolute scale. Knowing these units is part of learning the language of science, because accurate measurement is essential for collecting and communicating data. To wrap up, this chapter introduced the foundations of biology and the way scientists study life. We looked at biology as the study of living things, explored cells as the basic unit of life, and examined key ideas like biological organization, homeostasis, and evolution. We also connected those ideas to the scientific process by discussing hypotheses, facts, experiments, variables, theories, laws, and measurement. Together, these concepts give you the basic framework you'll need for the rest of the course. As we move forward, keep in mind that biology is not just about memorizing terms. It's about understanding patterns in life and using evidence to explain them.